Già che ho preso la parola, vi ricordo ovviamente gli studenti del corso sono informati, ma ricordo anche per gli ospiti che questo evento un po' speciale della Christmas Lecture che abbiamo organizzato con il nostro ospite Peter Carroll da Dublino, dall'Irlanda, professore all'Università di Limerick, peraltro in Irlanda, è un po' organizzato un po' come una pezza finale, diciamo, di questo ciclo di conferenze che abbiamo fatto durante novembre, che si chiama November Talks, organizzato dagli Iuav insieme con la Stiftung, che è questa fondazione tedesca che ha collaborato con noi con grande generosità a organizzare questi eventi. Il ciclo di quest'anno era dedicato in particolare al senso degli architetti per il paesaggio, e quindi era dedicato in particolare ai rapporti tra architettura e paesaggio. Naturalmente non solo questo sarà poi il tema della conferenza di Peter Carroll, che interverrà anche più in generale sui lavori del suo studio A2, A2 irlandese, ma c'è anche la circostanza favorevole che c'è anche un rapporto di esperienza di Peter Carroll con le questioni dell'arte, anche un rapporto con il tema del corso arte e architettura, nelle relazioni tra arte e architettura. Quindi abbiamo trovato, diciamo, questa possibilità di far confluire in questa conferenza natalizia, che è anche un motivo per farci gli auguri, ne abbiamo credo molto bisogno tutti quanti quest'anno. Ecco, vedo che Antonio Romano si è collegato, e adesso poi gli darò la parola. Appunto, dicevo, è un'occasione per riallacciare i nodi, diciamo, di tutti questi vari fili che abbiamo intessuto in questo periodo. Antonio, vedo che ti sei collegato.
Sì, mi sono collegato, sono riuscito. Ecco.
Prego.
Sì, va bene, buongiorno a tutti, in questa forma eccezionale di questa conferenza un po'...
Antonio,
sì.
non ti vediamo però nella
non lo so, non riesco la camera, non si collega, non so perché.
Pazienza, sentiamo la tua voce.
Pazienza, mi sentite, va? Quindi con oggi siamo un po' arrivati alla sesta conferenza grazie a questa iniziativa del professor Bocchi che conclude un po' il ciclo dell'anno 2020. Noi continuiamo con sto Stiftung a sostenere queste attività soprattutto nella formazione delle giovani generazioni, e per questo motivo la Fondazione Sto sostiene i giovani in questo loro iter formativo professionale e accademico. Vorrei ringraziare nuovamente un po' tutti quelli che hanno partecipato, l'architetto che ha accettato l'invito per questa conferenza, e naturalmente ringrazio anche lo Sto Stiftung che ci sostiene in queste attività. Vorrei cogliere l'occasione per augurare a tutti quelli che sono in ascolto e a tutti quelli che ci hanno seguito in questo percorso un sincero augurio di buon Natale. Buon ascolto.
Molte grazie Antonio. I thank you all, in particularly Peter Carroll, for participating to this lecture. And now I I give the word to Nicola Russolo. Nicola Russolo is a young architect, graduated in our school, and he worked also in Ireland and in Scotland, and so is the mediation for our contact with Peter Carroll in Ireland, and so I would like that Nicola can introduce the speech of Peter, and then we listen to Peter.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Bocchi, and to Sto Foundation, Antonio, for the opportunity. So I'll try to be very brief because you're going to see a lot from Peter's presentation. As you may know, well, Peter Carroll is the director of A2 Architects and a senior lecturer at the School of Architecture at the University of Limerick. And he's been teaching in many other universities around Europe, like in Dublin and Madrid and Stockholm and Nottingham. Tell me if I'm wrong. I'll try to be fair in the presentation also. A2 projects won many awards nationally in Ireland and also being nominated to many awards like the EU Miss Award for Contemporary Architecture twice. And they represented Ireland in the Lisbon Architecture Triennale in 2007 and the Chicago Architecture Biennale in 2015. And they also exhibited at Venice Architecture Biennale in 2018. A good start for introducing the design approach of A2, at least I think, is a phrase I remember from the first lecture I've heard by A2 architects in Dublin. It was back in 2012, and I remember Peter saying, I think, that for something to look simple, there's a lot of work to be done. So there's a lot of complex work behind something that at the end will look simple, and this applies not only to like small things and to materials and to details, but also like at every design stage, I believe. So for something to look neat or to look correct in terms of construction, like to think, oh, this was just meant to be like this and there's no other way, there's a lot of work to be done before the result. And a way to present A2's work is that in their work there's a lot of research on one side, and there's also a lot of knowledge and attention to construction, to how things are built. So there's experience and knowledge about that as well. And starting from these two perspectives, there's a multi-scalar approach to design. So it's informed and takes advantage of the relationship of a place or a building with the history of the place, the landscape, the urban fabric, the urban context, and at the same time takes great care in developing details right from the beginning of a project as well, as I've experienced when I was there. And very often one of the two aspects can be overlooked in the practice of architecture, so in an office or in a studio, but both are needed if the results that we aim to are outstanding projects. So I think that you can see this quality in the project that Peter is going to present you in all the scales of projects, because we're going to see things from the very small, from the furniture design up until the design of big complexes like of urban scale almost. And another thing that I find is very interesting in A2's work is the prominence of space, in the sense of the focus on shaping spaces. And that's something that should be totally obvious in the practice of architecture, but it's not always, mainly like now when architecture is very often just an image in this moment when like we communicate through Instagram and stuff, but that's very often more an image or a 2D nice representation than a spatial idea. And I think that instead you can see this approach as being very, like being really at the core of A2's work, and you may see this also in art-related projects and in their exhibition work. And that's it, I think. And finally, I'm honored to present this lecture by Peter Carroll, and I hope you enjoy it. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much, Nicola. for facilitating this, and also to Professor Bocchi. Renato, you've done a terrific job organising this series, and it's an honour to be speaking to your university today in the heart of Venice, and indeed to Antonio as well for his lovely introduction. I intend to translate it so that I understand it in full after the lecture, but thank you very much. I also want to thank the Stowe Foundation for also sponsoring this lecture very generously. And it must be said, initiatives like this must be supported going forward, given our current circumstances and the ability indeed to be able to communicate online and virtually like this. So I'll begin my lecture. I want to open with a photograph by Anthony Haughey, who's an Irish photographer. It's a photograph taken in 1996 of a sea pool in Belmullet in County Mayo, the northwest of Ireland, and it's an estuarine bay where a river feeds into Blacksod Bay in Belmullet. And I open with it because it probably it represents many aspects that I have begun to become much more focused on in our practice, to do with weather, to do with the scale and the geometries that one finds within landscape, but also the relationship between the man-made and the natural. Not to be too simplified about it, but this is a pool, a liminal pool, I would say, where you are seeing the moment where the tidal waters reach the height of the contained water within the sea pool. And it's a concrete rim that's showing, but you see the footprints and the action of humans, both walking around the lip of the pool and also swimming within it. So you have this amazing moment where you have a still body of water with a ruffled water surface within the pool itself. And for me, it encapsulates so much about landscape being about detail, but also being something epic. And I will talk more about that as I go through the work, because there's a number of recurring interests in our practice over the last number of years, primarily to do with ground and understanding how one begins construction, how you understand the geology, how you understand the biodiversity, the weather systems, the imprint of humanity on our planet. And this photograph by Anthony Haughey really does, for me, summarize many interests simply and effectively in this vast, open, somewhat lonely landscape that talks about horizon, that talks about weather system, and that talks about the making of place, and indeed the lines and the bound nature of this body of water within a much larger scale and context. I want to begin just giving you a little bit of context for those who are not familiar with Dublin. Our practice is based on Ormond Quay on the north side of the River Liffey, and it's a section of the river that was developed in the 1700s by the Duke of Ormond, Richard Butler. And you can see here the canalized edge of the river. You have this wonderful cut incised steps into the riverbank on the south side, with these very beautiful wrought iron railings to allow for those who wish to get into the river. But our office is directly to the far side, and I suppose it again speaks to a broader interest in recognizing and registering light, reflection, sunlight, the taming of nature in many ways with this canalized river, which would have previously been less consolidated. And our office, I suppose, gets to enjoy this given the relationship that we have directly with the reflections off the river to the south. This is an interior view of the office. Again, we're a small office of 10 people. And this is effectively a window onto the city. It's a ground floor unit. And in many ways, it has become important to us because we recognize the power of being actually on the ground floor where you are interacting with all of these passing heads as we are within our office. And it has brought an energy and a life to our office that we wouldn't have previously recognized. We've been in previous locations, but in this particular location in Dublin, it has this very, very rich relationship with the city, and it's begun to affect our work very much so in our interest in the public realm. And you will see a little bit more of that as I work through the project over the course of this morning's lecture. I want to begin with probably our first project that began our office for us. It's a project from 2009, and you can see on the north of the image there a bar of yellow plots, and there's an encircled yellow red outline to the yellow plots where it shows the first of two houses which was to be built within the landscape of the city. Now, you might ask why I'm showing you a city project when the subject of the lecture series is very much landscape. Again, this was an opportunity to think beyond it being just an initial project of two houses. We wanted it to be something larger. What I like about this image is very much the river to the south. This is the River Liffey as it winds its way into the city and out into Dublin Bay. You can see on the very southwest of the image our main train station, Euston Station, as it arrives into the city. Much like the train station in Venezia, you do arrive to the river, and in many ways it is our main duct or our line, our conduit effectively into our city centre. But what's also quite remarkable, I think, about this image is the amazing layout of the artisan dwellings. And you can see the grain going from the northwest to the southeast of the drawing of these amazing terraces that faced southwest and northeast in their orientation. They have this very, very strong pattern built by Arthur Guinness and other people who were interested in the care and attention of their workers. So these were very dense housing units. And when you look to this over the city, it's an entire landscape in itself, in this case of chimneys and yards out the back and plots of garden, and where gardens can survive, they do. The particular location, if you can see my mouse, is this location here where I begin to develop a terrace of houses for myself and neighbours. But what's also very beautiful about this is going from the density of Stoneybatter into the openness and vastness of Europe's largest urban park, which is Phoenix Park, to the north of Stoneybatter. So in many ways, one might think this as a very urban project, but I also like to think of it as a landscape project. And in order to try and register that scale of landscape, as Nicola said at the outset, we make a lot of models in our office, and this is a model looking from north to south. So here you have on the southwest of the image the terrace of new housing that we were proposing in the very long back gardens of houses to Ockram Street. And what we were trying to acknowledge within this model here was effectively the 2,000 homes that live very, very densely. They don't have front gardens, they have yards to the back, and they're tightly packed in with one another. And they make for this amazing sense of neighbourhood, and any nature within that is prized. So our interest here was very much about garden walls and ensuring that the house that we developed for this new lane called Lucky Lane in Dublin 7 was an intention to ensure that the house went beyond its plot and somehow informed the context of the urban landscape. So very, very briefly, there's a section on the top and a plan of the first floor, and then on the bottom of the image, a plan on the ground floor. It's a very, very simple house, cellular in nature on the ground floor with 2 bedrooms, a study and 2 bathrooms. And then on the first floor, you have a very open kitchen, living, dining space. And you'll see in the plans of the plots, there is an interest in making more ambiguous the nature of what a plot division is. So you have part of a plot wall that begins in one house, that comes along and makes the boundary division and becomes the envelope for the other house. So the intention here was again to show an extension of the house into the gardens in many ways, and to try and engage with the city landscape proper. If you can see in the section here as well, the more cellular rooms of study and bedroom are on the ground floor, and then on the upper floor it's meant to be something that registers the orientation, registers the sunlight to the house and to the city proper. So when you do look at this in its context, this is a slide of the lane. It's very much a mews lane where there wouldn't be footpaths or specific areas for pedestrians. It's very much a working utility road. And this was, I suppose, an opportunity to set up a new order of typology for a house. You can see the language of the house is very spare. We were using galvanized mild steel that was clad onto a brick envelope, into which were placed a number of screens to ensure privacy to neighbouring houses. But when you look into the house itself, the house is very, very simple in many ways. It goes from plot wall to plot wall. And what we were trying to reinforce within the house itself was an interest in span from one party wall to another party wall, and also that the windows would be systematic in many ways, large sheets of glass that would move and slide, but that would reinforce the relationship of inside to outside with these large brick walls that were reinforcing the plots to the houses. When you go into the ground floor, as I said, it's cellular in nature. The hall is wrapped in a birch plywood. The polished concrete floor goes from room to room so that there's no division whatsoever. It's a continuous flow. And likewise, over the doors, there's no door heads. Effectively, the ceiling runs from room to room in order to give it that sense of expanse. So the first space I just showed you earlier was the entrance courtyard, and much like a knight's move in chess, you have this slipped plan where on the diagonal you have a garden to the other side of the corner. So you're constantly getting natural light into all of the spaces. No paint was used whatsoever in this house. All of the surfaces were natural. And what was very impressive was the hand of the plaster on the ceiling, and being able to see the actual marks of the plastering and the skimming that was put onto the plasterboard. So very, very small things that were enjoyed, but again, within the context of detail to large scale, there's also this interest in relationship to the city proper at large. So much like a Japanese villa per se, you're getting borrowed landscapes of gardens beyond the house. And this would have been the original house to the back, off which we would have bought one of the sites. And you can see here the very spare detailing of the interior. It's kept very, very simple. The internal boards run from inside to outside. Brick likewise runs from inside to outside with a hidden thermal break between the windows. And then to the other side, you get these borrowed moments of buddleia and weeds growing from the chimneys that I would have shown you earlier of the neighbouring houses. So in many ways, it's an internal looking house, but likewise you have these amazing, almost Judd-like-esque moments where the sky is trapped by the edges of the walls. And you have this orientation southwest northeast that allows for a morning terrace to one side and an evening terrace to the other. And I suppose looking back on it, it was an important project for us in that it established an interest in the space beyond the project itself, and that there was a need to engage with a much larger opportunity, which was to inform public space, but also to inform a kind of an engagement with a city landscape itself. To say about beginnings, I also want to just bring in very, very briefly my own interest in Limerick. I'm from Limerick City myself. I live and work in Dublin, but I was born in Limerick, and I teach now in Limerick at the university on the edge of Limerick City. This is a map that we would have created in my first year while teaching at the University of Limerick, which was to try and map the city and the hinterland of the city without boundaries, without any local administrative boundaries that divide artificially one piece of city to another. And at this time, the county and the city in Ireland, in Limerick, weren't separated, or that they were about to be conjoined. So there was a need to understand the city proper as a whole. What I like about this image is the density of the Georgian core in the center. You have this very, very dramatic Georgian grid that's from the 18th century through to the 19th century at the core of Limerick City that still to this day remains resilient. And it's something that I've been very, very interested in since I began teaching at the school, and in some ways has informed my practice with regards to a need to engage with local authority, to engage with a larger community beyond yourself and your client on a particular project. Limerick City is quite an elegant city in many ways. It's a compass. It's a destination city, but it also orientates you to the landscape. There is very, very little of our city that is actually planted or is landscaped. But what you do have are these amazing vistas to the northwest, to the southeast, to the southwest, and to the northeast, where you get opportunities to look beyond to the Clare Hills, to the Tipperary Hills, onto the Ballinacurra Road, and back into the city proper, whichever part of the grid that you're in. And I've always found this a kind of a remarkable place. But what has begun to inform me a lot more is this interest in the ground. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this as we go through it, because I think it's important in the context of landscape. Within all of these beautiful cartographic representations of Limerick, you have what would have been the ground level of the city. In order to begin the Georgian houses, they needed to be supported by a complete system of cellars and culverts in order to deal with storage, to deal with drainage, and to deal with a sloping rock plain to the base of the houses. And you also have this very, very strong relationship to the river Shannon, which is at its widest point when it arrives into Limerick City. And what I found over the time was through the opportunity, or through the threat, I suppose, of roadworks and the damage that the roadworks were doing to the groundscape of the city, all of these culverts and cellars were being revealed through a need to reinforce sections of road. And this was a sore point for many within the city, but it was also an opportunity to realize, hang on, there's actually an incredible substrate to this city that somehow determines what is built above it, but also manages its relationship to flooding, to waste, and to our ability to be able to inhabit and use the public realm of the city. This was like a moment where I felt there was a whole Roman catacomb system under the city, where you get the top layer of the road simply removed, and you have these amazing brick arches that spring from calc limestone walls to what would be the natural rock level of the city. And when one thinks about this on a Georgian scale, you have this need to make the groundscape. And this is a section that we did in the university to try and understand a sloping substrate towards the river of the Georgian city, and the need to make a whole system of cellars and culverts that would enable the foundations for these amazing gridded blocks of Georgian construction. I'm not sure whether you can see that drawing. It's a little bit light, but it's meant to be a full drawing of the network of culverts and cellars and party walls of the city. I'm sorry now that it may be a little bit light, but it's a representation by me of that particular groundscape, and it's something that has been a touchstone for me and my teaching practice as well as my own practice over the last number of years. So going from that, there was an opportunity 2 years ago following the opportunity to contribute to the Venice Biennale, where myself and Kevin Callahan, an Irish artist, were asked to contribute to an exhibition in the Palazzo Michele della Colonna, which is on the northern bank of the Grand Canal, just east of the Ca d'Oro. And we started the collaboration by trying to understand again the precarious nature of ground. And for Venetians listening to the lecture, you will all be familiar with this staking or piling of the ground with large poles from trees in order to establish the ground level of the city of Venice. And it's always been a very, very compelling image for me in a way that allows for the consolidation and for the ability to be able to spring from a ground condition up. And these are works that were revealed during enabling works for one of the fondamentas in Cannaregio, as I remember. And it did reveal a fascinating landscape and substrate to the city of Venice as they began to repair the edges to the canals. So part of this, you can see the arrival of our piece into the Palazzo Michele. It's opposite the Rialto markets. And again, what I found remarkable about this whole process was the actual logistics of getting something from Ireland to Venice and understanding all of the logistics and all of the challenges that entails. So certainly something arriving by boat up the Grand Canal was both a pleasure and a deep complexity to get over. And it was something that was very, very enjoyable. I must say, this is our piece arriving. And again, it was probably an explicit reference in many ways to the landscape of Venice, where you do have these amazing piles that go deep into the ground in order to stabilize the lagoon landscape of mudflats in and around the city of Venice. And this photograph also just describes in detail, I suppose, the top of our piece where you are making this level platform. And it was just one of those very enjoyable moments, I felt, where you're establishing a datum at eye level to our piece with all of the end grain of these large poles that we would have stained in order to ensure their longevity. Upstairs in the Baroque Palazzo, this is our piece Kevin Callahan made for 3 pseudo-generic, let's call them sculptural pieces of city that were made from estuarine mud. Kevin is an artist who works with clay from riverbanks, and he would have looked to 3 rivers, 2 in Ireland and 1 in Scotland outside Glasgow, where he would have reclaimed the mud and made for sculpture to allow for him to bake the clay for the pieces that he was making. What I particularly like about this image is the terrazzo floors and the relationship of our pencil pin points to this particular floor. And I did enjoy very much, again, the establishment of these pieces on the ground and being able to negotiate with the Palazzo Michele, the relationship of our piece to the floors. And again, you can see Kevin's pieces then on top of this new datum that we were making for the sculptural pieces within the palazzo. To go from there to a project that has remained dear to us, and in the context of consolidating ground, much like what I was just saying about Limerick and our Venetian piece, this was a competition that we did 3 years ago now in the city of Cork. Otherwise known in medieval through to early Georgian times as the Venice of the North, primarily because of its networks of canals in order to establish transport through the city. A lot of these canals and roads are now roofed over and culverted in order to provide for streetscapes. But the area to the north of the city, or sorry, to the south of this particular map from 1759 by John Rock, is an area known as Morrison's Island. And in this particular map, it shows it as mud flats. But prior or subsequent to this map being made, it was actually consolidated in a similar way to the Venetian landscape, where they would have piled into the ground and edged the island with limestone walls. So this is a model that we would have made, and that the project that was being called for here was to try and understand how we would be able to temper the city landscape from floods. And the national body, the Office of Public Works, are planning to build a higher wall around this island. And in consequence to that, there was a group of people called Save Cork City that established a counter movement that was to say, let's not build a high wall to the edge of our river, but look to ways in which the water would be able to be absorbed into the city in a creative manner. So in many ways, we wanted to ensure that the ground itself was the subject of this, not so much building or anything to do with architecture necessarily, but more about groundscape and reinforcing a new public realm, a new strata for people to be able to observe and understand how water interrelates with a city environment. If you're wondering what the triangular project is there to the northwest of the project, that was an earlier competition that we did where we were interested in the figure of triangles and how they relate to various outlooks from the city, like the Bandon Tower or the Shandon Tower. And then the project itself that we are looking at here to the south is Morrison's Island, which is very much about the ground as opposed to the figure. So one aspect that we started to get very interested in was this notion of using wood for paving. And you can see in this image here a desire to use end grain woodblock, a hardwood with an impregnated finish, with gravelled and blinded gaps and joints between the timber blocks in order to ensure for a permeable surface, so that the ground would operate as a sponge as opposed to a surface where you would be able to absorb the water coming from both the ground and from the rivers during times of tidal surge or otherwise. And we were looking at cities like Paris, where there is a hierarchy and a relationship from the river level up to the river banks, and then higher up further onto the street levels, where you're getting an integration of nature and planting, but also leisure into the city and ensuring that all can survive depending on the relative nature of the water level around the city. We were looking at swales and how to absorb water into depressions within the ground in order to ensure that there was opportunities for water to be absorbed. And we were also looking at corner moments within the city where you might introduce fountains. And for the Italians listening in, you'll be very familiar with San Carlo della Quattro Fontane in Rome by Borromini, forgive me, please. This is one of those moments. I know the interior of the church is a spectacular moment, but I particularly like the civility and the elegance of providing for fountains in corners. It's something that we have in some ways forgotten about in our city landscapes. And this is a moment, I suppose, where you're acknowledging the need for a drink of water or the need to wash your hands within a city, and that it's a civilized moment and it's decorated as such. So thinking about the ground, thinking about moments, thinking about diversity of landscape, we began to develop this full floor plan for the island. And in drawing the island with this wood grain, end grain woodblock throughout, with swales, with planting, that we would somehow revert to a common surface where it wasn't just pedestrians, but cars could also use this. But that it was somehow civilized by the large move of making a common surface with end grain wood block. And in doing so, that opened up the laneways and the spaces between buildings in order to revitalize, as well as to bring in a greater sense of permeability into parts of the city that were not known up to that time and give it an identity. So here we were looking at varying levels of plants. We were particularly interested in plants that would deal with alluvial water, as well as the marine water coming in. So it needed to be able to deal with an interturbulent water condition. So you're getting everything from shrubs and grasses through to plants and flowers, through to fruit plants and through to taller plants. And trying to find that balance, I suppose, as to doing as little as possible in order to give a maximum impact. And it was a very enjoyable project because it got us thinking about, I suppose, small moments within a city where you can make a small intervention, but it can have a much larger polemical impact by altering people's perceptions as to what can happen within a city scale. So these are just some renderings of that, looking from one of the bridges towards St. John's Church and along the quayside to Morrison's Island, and our limited intervention of groundscape, small pieces of furniture and the planting. So going from that into another project that registers water, this is a project that we collaborated on with John Gerard, the artist, and John and A2 Architects were invited to, I suppose, locate and to read and to try and register this particular context that we were working in. What you have here in front of you is a photograph that John was holding up, looking towards the river Javaneker that passes through Kistefos, and it describes bales of paper. And in Kistefos, it was up until 5 years ago the last paper printing, the last paper mill in Norway. And the Norwegian economy would have been very, very strong in terms of its need to make paper. It was one of their biggest industries before they discovered hydrocarbons. And what was interesting about this location was all of the industrial archaeology of the paper mill, and a need somehow to register the last closing days of the paper mill. It was effectively being decommissioned, and the paper mill was being handed over to the locals as a sculpture park. So with that in mind, we developed an enclosure for one of John's projections. And this is a photograph, or sorry, a sketch of a perspective looking towards our intervention onto the river Javaneker that flows quite fast beyond the pavilion. And it was meant to be a framing of both John's real-time projection of a paper mill process, which he did in great detail, and I'll show you a few images of that in a moment. But it was also for us to try and calibrate the relationship between his artwork and the nature that it was being placed into. So this was a framing, a kind of a deep cave in many ways, a very simple portal that looks.
We cannot hear you, Peter. Your microphone.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, okay. Now it works.
I don't know what happened there, apologies. This is particularly interesting in its setting in that it looks northeast towards the river. And the river up to this point is quite a wide river, and it would have been for the transport of logs down from the forests towards the paper mill plant itself. And this particular jetty would have been the jetty that allowed for the collection of the logs as they were floated down the river towards the paper mill. Beyond this point, there's a hydroelectric dam, which basically processed the water and the speed of the water in order to generate electricity for the paper mill. But our particular intervention here is minimal in many ways. It's got a very subtle footprint. You can see 2 outer walls and 1 cantilevering wall 2/3 into the plan that is a wall that basically accommodates the projection that John Gerard was allowing for. Now, you might be asking why. I'm just having a difficulty going on to the next image. It's not allowing me go on to the next image. Sorry, Nicola.
Can maybe try to close this and open again. I'll try to retrieve your presentation on my computer.
Yeah, if you could do that. I don't know what's happening here. Apologies about this.
Okay, let's try.
You want me to do it? I can do it.
I can.
Let me try. Here we go. I have it.
Does it work? Okay.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Thank you. So these are very simple roof plans, elevations, and a side elevation that shows the pavilion. It's effectively 2 walls, a ground floor and a roof. But what this ground floor does is that it registers the 50-year flood level of the River Javenica, and that was very, very important from the point of view of this artwork that needed to survive 365 days of the year within a pretty harsh landscape of snow during the winter time and more extreme heat in the summertime. So our project very much became about registering flood levels. So we established the height of the pavilion in relation to the river level pretty much from the outset. And you can see here the manipulation of the roof plane itself in order to be able to house the projector that would project John Gerard's artwork. It's a very, very simple concrete box. We showed the patterning of the concrete, and you may kind of see that there's a very strong leaning towards Donald Judd's work, particularly in and around Marfa in Texas. And we were quite interested in the very elemental nature of this piece. So here we have a photograph of the River Javenica as it flows towards the pavilion. And we decided in this particular pavilion to take the energy of the river and put in a small micro turbine to generate the power for the projection within this river in order to give power to the pavilion. So as you are coming off this road, you can see you come down off the level of the path as it comes through the sculpture park down into this pavilion. And within the pavilion, you can see this floating image. And we carefully crafted John's image to ensure that it would bleed right to the edges of the walls. So you have this almost surreal relationship between the video simulation of the paper mill process itself and the flowing river behind it. And it's very much like the sketch that I would have shown you at the outset. It's a darkened cave. We pigmented the interior of the cave with a black pigment in order to allow for the survival of the image. And here is another image of that particular moment when you're coming closer down towards the pavilion. You have large pivoting doors to the edges and to the center that allow for the box to be closed at times. And you have the recess in the ceiling to allow for the projector to be disguised within the concrete body itself. The concrete is very, very simple. When we were casting this concrete, it was -25, and we actually had to put a big vacuum bubble around the construction site. It was like something from Archigram and Acoustical, which was absolutely fabulous to see. And I'd never, ever seen concrete being poured in such extreme conditions. But it was certainly a pleasure to come back during the summer and see the nature and the framing of the nature through our piece within the context of this fast-flowing river, which you can hear outside. Coming further into the pavilion, you can see a number of planks and benches that are made in precast concrete with brass legs and aluminium plates. And each of those circles effectively are to be embedded with a box, which I will show you in a moment. And the boxes basically contain the memory of the video simulation for the year. So it's effectively like a data center or a data bank, where you're providing for a bank of these very simple brass boxes that are to be fixed and connected onto the river. Every single piece of paper that is made in this video simulation is different. So there was an incredible amount of effort and work done by John to ensure that this was a proper, unique, I suppose, reading as much as a memory of the paper mill itself. What I like about this image, again, is just the view that you have to the edge and to the river, where you're both seeing the image of the projection itself, but you're also hearing the river and what generated all of this paper and the life of the paper mill itself prior to it turning into a sculpture park. These are the boxes, and you can see in the first year the placement of one brass box on top of these very simple precast concrete planks onto brass legs, which we had made locally. And then to the far side of that wall, you have this baldacchino or moment or balcony that looks onto the river itself. And again, very, very small things that we noted when we were making this was almost the map-like data that was placed from the pores of the concrete into its formwork, and the patterning of the formwork, almost marble-like in nature. And we did feel that there was an echo of that in relation to the escarpments of the river and the edge of the river itself. So there's this nice dialogue between both an experience that is contained, that is about memory, and then there's also this more haptic relationship to the river itself, and an opportunity to temporarily leave the artwork and sit and watch the river as it flows through into the hydroelectric plant further on down. A number of actions that we have done, and in some ways related to water, but also the scale of landscape and to an interest in line. This is a piece by Max Bill from 1935, and it's one of 15 drawings that he would have done, which he would have described as variations on a single theme. And here you have an equilateral triangle that becomes a square, that becomes a hexagon, that becomes a septagon, and variants. So what I find particularly interesting about this, though, is that you can make something that has balance and equilibrium from one line. And there's a very strong interest here in geometry in the work of Max Bill, and it's always been a fascination of mine, trying to understand the relationship of mathematics to line and to shape, and also how that might generate space and something of scale. And related to that is an interest in the spiral jetty by Robert Smithson from 1970. And it was a very, very simple earthwork made from mud, from salt crystals, and from the basalt rock in the Great Plains of Utah. And Robert Smithson would have chosen this as a kind of an anti-pastoral moment, in a way looking onto the Golden Spike site, with also vestiges of industry in the locality to the spiral jetty. And he was making something that was of a scale and of a scope that was much, much larger than it just being a work. It managed to capture the size and the scale in many ways, like the pool that I showed you at the outset of the lecture, where Anthony Haughey was capturing a trapped body of water. This is a monumental piece of work that is made from minimal means with the greatest effect. So from that, quite literally, we took a line in the landscape. This was a commission to enable for €5,000 a bench that would travel the county of Dún Laoghaire, Rathdown, for a year. So we were being asked to make something that would be transportable, that would be quite light, but that would be able to activate a large public space that was up to that point somewhat underused. So we felt immediately there was an opportunity to do something quite simple from a line that might involve geometry, but that also might involve scale, and that would somehow allude to these great artworks that we were interested in by Max Bill and Robert Smithson. And you can see here from the plan, it's a widened bench of 550 millimeters. It's painted red, signal red. We have a back bench to the start, and then it curls in and around itself in order to make for a forum. And I suppose it was an opportunity for us to be able to study and understand how you make something quite light and effective at a small scale, at the level of detail that would allow for something to grow and to make something much, much larger. So here's a sketch effectively looking at drums of concrete that we would have cast with eye-level lifting eyelets, with a bolted piece of timber into the concrete drum, and then onto that you would have your decking boards for the jetty, which would provide for seating for the public. So this is an image where we placed it beside the very beautiful library by Carcotter Nessens Architects, which is the Dún Laoghaire Library. And in front here to the southwest, you have our red jetty placed within Moran Park in order to try and inform and generate a place for people to be able to sit. So this is looking from the library out into the Moran Park, and what you have here again is this extent of line and geometry, and trying to, I suppose, enable for people to be able to inhabit a space of that size with comfort and with certain joy. So these are observations of just an action, I suppose, that we would have done in order to determine how people might use it. And there were opportunities when kids would run down the planks, or when all of the foreign students in Dublin would gather for beer or for cigarettes, or for old people to have a coffee. And the very nice thing about this was that it moved around the county for a year. So this was in Marley Park, which is an area fronting a very beautiful house, and an opportunity to be able to place a public bench to inform an edge of a park. And again, every age group were occupying this. It wasn't just for adults, it was obviously for kids as well. And there would have been events planned around the bench for children to interact with the space and the locale. And then other kids who were finding other opportunities to describe and express themselves with the edges of the bench, which I always find enjoyable. Another action that we are currently involved in, and again, it's at a landscape scale. One of the city, Galway City, is here to the northeast, and you have Salt Hill Promenade to the southwest of the image. Interestingly, in this photograph, you have the River Corrib that splits Galway City as a medieval city from the suburban growths of Galway into Salt Hill to the southwest. And through research, we found that the geology of Galway is limestone, and everything west of the River Corrib is granite. So what we were being asked to do here was to intervene and find opportunities for the citizens of Galway and beyond to find solace and find space within the streetscapes to allow for small parks, or parkini as we were calling them, or otherwise known as parklets, and places for bike stands and people to be able to park their bicycles. So in all, we have 11 bike stands along the promenade, and we have 6 parklets within the city. So we started again looking at maps. This is an early 19th century map of the medieval heart of Galway city, where you have the Eglinton Canal and the River Corrib coming out into Galway Bay. And what we find quite beautiful about this, beyond the colour of the blue, the light sky blue and the pink, the fuchsia pink, is the way people were drawing gardens. And what you find here is the gardens were drawn in very much ways to show the planting, but also to show the drainage. So you have this very rich herringbone patterning being shown, and hatchings throughout all of the gardens that in some cases were public, but in the majority of cases were private. And we took this as a kind of a starting point to inform ourselves as to how we might make small interventions that would be effective at a much larger scale. So we began to draw and doodle. These are sketches effectively playing with the geometry again, and looking at how you might make for a unit, in this case a parallelogram and a triangle, and how you might be able to make for quite a rich territory where plants, where seats, where tables, and where bicycles might be able to be parked. So this is within a dimension of 2.5 to 3 meters at most, and anything up to 20 meters in length, where we would be thickening out an edge to a footpath. And this was an opportunity also again to look at bicycle stands. And this was what we were looking for Salt Hill, where we would be making a bank of planters that would protect the bicycles from a crumple zone for cars if they were to crash into this, but also to extend the public realm of the promenade and allow for a herringbone pattern to the flooring of the bicycle stands themselves. What you'll see here is an interest in relief, in profile. We were looking at the work of Brancusi, Constantine Brancusi, and his infinite monument. And we were quite interested in the relationship of profile of landscape and topography and colour to Galway. Galway is a coastal city on the west of the island of Ireland, and quite different to other cities in its relationship, very direct relationship to both weather and to its coastal location. So we were very keen to try and find a microcosm to be able to express that condensed mini landscape. So just a few models to bring you through. I won't spend too long describing these, but these are effectively folding planes that fold in the 2-dimensional plan, but also in section to make for occupied edges. And here we were looking at the Cranú na Mód, the gathering of the boats. There's a very beautiful book called the Galway boat that's called the Galway Hooker. And we were very interested in almost bringing that to the kind of the imagination of people that might be both living in Galway, but also visiting Galway, and seeing that almost clear image in their minds when they would look to something like this. And you can see again, it's faceted to both the riverside as well as to the promenade side. So what you're getting here is a number of folding mini landscapes, much like a microcosm of the coast, where you're getting inlets and also islands of planting. So here we are topping the seats with a rilled limestone from Galway, Ballinasloe, and we're also prefabricating these units at the moment presently in steel, in a marine grade stainless steel that are to be powder coated. There are a number of other versions that we were looking at. This is a playful pink and green bench, again for another area near a children's school, where we were keen to enable children to be able to interact again with the edge of the footpaths and the road, and to allow for medieval gardens and the kind of rich planting of herbs and flowering plants and fruits within these planters. Another version, and yet another version of a long bench So there's a family of interrelated parks, little parks, as we're calling them in Irish, porcini, that will hopefully animate the streets of Galway in the coming months. And as part of the bike stands, then we were looking at gabions and gabion tower constructions, where we would be able to embed QR codes to allow for people to get information, opportunities to sit. Also these interchangeable triangular units, and then park stands, bicycle stands, which we've developed further since. And some perspectives to show the relationship of these liminal edge conditions. Here you have the Salt Hill Promenade and the relationship immediately to the road. On the left, obviously the promenade to the right, and then the Galway Bay beyond, and the horizon of the Clare Hills further beyond that. And looking towards a diving point, this is Blackrock at the very, very end of the promenade, where you're looking out to the Aran Islands, and you have the profile of the Clare Hills from the Burren on the far side, and our interest again here in bringing in some granite, given that it's a granite geological base to the Salt Hill side of the city. Taking you another direction, if I may, this is a project in Tullamore in the centre of Ireland, and it was a competition that we won a number of years ago for an art centre. And the image that I have here in front of me is of a bog cutting, where the ground is effectively scrope, and you have these logs of peat, which is a natural sphagnum compressed into a turf that can be burnt. It's a very kind of low grade of fuel, but it would have been a very important fuel source for many, many households in Ireland over the centuries. What I do find very beautiful about this, and it's probably obvious from the image, is this striation that you get, very much like the maps that I would have shown you at the outset of Stony Batter, where you get this very, very strong, almost abstract grain running across the landscape at a scale that is somewhat unusual. And again, the colouring of the landscape being brown, the scaling of these briquettes or logs of turf that are effectively taken from the ground and machined, are in some ways quite phenomenal. And the unitized system of these logs as well is also something to register in terms of the increment of a piece of fuel. And what you do get is people coming out a number of months later when the peat has dried out in order to turn the turf and to allow for that to dry out, and you get these amazing stacked columns of turf. So it was into that kind of context of low-lying ground, of open plains of scale, where you have effectively a bog landscape that we were being asked to consider a competition proposal. Now, another thing to be said about the relationship of Tullamore, which is roughly here, if you can see my mouse. No, you can't. It's okay. It's about 2/3 southwest of Dublin. Dublin is Dublin Bay to the east of the map. And along the Grand Canal, you have the Bog of Allen and the Grand Canal. And the Grand Canal meets the river system of the River Shannon. So you have this very emphatic line that connects through water artificially via a man-made canal, the east of the country, to the main river spine that is the Shannon River, that effectively goes down and empties out into Limerick and the estuary beyond. So we were being asked to consider placing an art centre on this particular emphatic line of the canal. And it was a site that was unusual in that it's called Kilbride Park, but it was formerly a landfill dump. So people would have dumped their domestic waste into a pocket of ground that was formerly a quarry at this particular point. And the quarry was for building of bridges along the canal. So the canal park side was infilled maybe 20 years ago. The landfill was topped and it became a park. And part of this proposal was to offer a community arts centre for Tullamore town. So you will see quite immediately that there's an intent here to register the geometry of this canal as it goes through the town. And that was the primary interest that we had here in this project. So another interest that we had in this was obviously art, and you'll note as I go through the projects that we do refer a lot to artwork. This is called Frontal, and it's from 1927 by Joseph and Annie Albers, and it's a very beautiful composition, again made of lines and of directions and overlaps. 3 colours used: an amber colour, a black and a white colour, but made into a very energetic field. And I've always enjoyed these abstract works of Joseph and Ali Albers, particularly because of their simplicity, but also the energy that they generate, and how, looking at art, you might be able to transfer some of that energy from an artwork into an architectural work. We were also looking at the Book of Durrow, and this is an old monastic medieval manuscript gospel book that is one of the 4 principal gospel books from that time in Ireland. It's a very beautiful book made in an insular style, and you have all sorts of Triskelion spirals and energies again within these artworks. And not to take them too literally, but what we were trying to again try and establish through looking at works like this that were local to Tullamore was an interest in the energy that was created through colour and through form and through line. So our proposal in many ways took its lead from those interests of the bog, the abstract lines in the landscape, the energy that you might get from a spiral, and also just how you might be able to direct people in and around the workings of this art centre. So you'll see it's got 4 sides. It doesn't have a front or a back. All elevations to this art centre are to be in many ways permeated as the main elevation. So we were placing this very Cartesian, simple form within the park that was square, 40 metres by 40 metres. And within that, we would make a pinwheel, much like the Triskelion patterns of the Book of Durrow, off which you would spin the exhibition space, the cafe space, the theatre space, and the arts spaces. And all of the elevations then would somehow register that striated, almost sedimented nature of the bog, and how you might be able to work with horizontal lines of varying densities. So the setting within the park, again, was very much to be seen as walls as opposed to building with a permeable edge. And what you see here is, again, is an interest to direct various rooms out from this central foyer space and into either of the 4 spaces that we were making, or out into the landscape of Kilbride Park and onto the Grand Canal to the north. So again, it wasn't meant to be just a building. It was a building within a landscape, within a territory, and we were very keen to try and register that almost epic scale of the bog within this relatively compressed site in Tullamore. And that developed into an interest in terracotta and marl, and we made this floating skirt around our proposal with timber beams that would pinwheel in and around from a central foyer space, and to make for all of these spaces that would allow for people to flow in and around the art centre while relating to this body of water, which was the Grand Canal as it passes through from Dublin through to Shannon Bridge. And another view of that. And you can see in the terracotta cladding a desire to register varying densities of terracotta panelling onto the timber structure of the building itself that had this concrete socle. Speaking of lines in the landscape, then this is a house that we would have completed a year and a half ago now. And this photograph, I suppose, tries to establish and register a critique of housing in Ireland, particularly in a rural setting over the last number of years. We have, one would say, blighted our landscape with many bungalows, which are generic carbon cookie cutout housing from pattern books almost, where people would just be given permission to build a house. And they've become the norm, unfortunately. And that has slowly become something that, as a practice, we have begun to criticize. And I suppose this was an opportunity here to make a house for a couple who wanted to, I suppose, live in relatively close proximity to the landscape itself, and also to be able to register things at great distance, such as the 12 bends or the horizon of the water beyond the house. So there was an opportunity, I suppose, here to make something that would be quite small in its footprint, but allow for the landscape to be taken in a much greater scale. Just to show you two sketches as to how it would have started. The house itself started as a number of erratics or blocks that would have contained the bedrooms, the toilets, terraces, utility spaces, and towards the sea front we would have placed this glazed screen. And that was modelled in a way almost like a large monopitch of Liscannor slate that would fall down towards the sea, but that would open up to the back of the house to the south, with all of these protected spaces for planting. The clients didn't buy into it, unfortunately, and we had to go through many iterations and arrive at a very enjoyable conclusion, I think. But just to show you a number of photographs here, this was a photograph of the house under construction, where I think the moment of truth came, where we were making a beam that was the first move of the house, that was lightly supported on piers and columns that bridged the valley of one hill to another, in order to allow for this house to read like a table or a tabletop, and somehow that the living would happen in and around and under this new tabletop that we were making. And that primarily, I suppose, is where the title of the lecture comes from, In, On and Over the Earth. This is again an interest in ground, an interest in reading and making legible the ground and the landscape, and also being able to ensure that we make spaces that relate not just to the detail, but also to the larger scale of the landscape itself. So this is the house as it was completed, and you can see here the meadow comes up from the seaside right up to the house proper and acts like a dam in very much a simple way. It's a 42-metre long cast in situ concrete beam, and it rests on either side on masonry bars or blocks, one for bedrooms and the other for utility. And in between that you have this living kitchen dining space again. Some very nice relationships with the hillscapes and the proximity of this quite boggy landscape as it comes down to the edge of the house, and the proximities that makes with the house are purposeful. We would have also been interested in the depth of the elevation and ensuring that there were slight kind of reveals and depths where the concrete would rest on the blockwork, and also allow for setbacks where we would integrate some local stone cladding with glazing in order to frame particular views. And this is a view looking from, again, closer towards the house and the concrete beam as it rests over this room, which is the living kitchen dining space, and the very, very simple details. And again, one had to be simple in a context like this because we were having to deal with winds of up to 125 miles an hour, which is quite strong. And all of the glazing and all of the detailing had to be very much considered with that in mind to be able to withstand the forces of nature. The plan itself is very straightforward. There's 3 bedrooms to the left of the plan. with their various serviced spaces. And then you have a smaller living room, off which you have the larger living kitchen dining space. And then behind that, you have various utility spaces, a small sunroom, a library towards the sea, and then further north, you have a garage space to deal with all of the utilities. But the most important thing here, I think, is to make the sheltered space behind the house. So to the south, we had this opportunity to make a microclimate or a sheltered space to allow for the planting and the biodiversity of the area to flourish. And the couple who live in this house had a very, very strong and continue to have a very strong interest in flowers and plants of the locale. So they were very, very keen to develop this particular pocket of sheltered landscape to the south. Before showing you that, I suppose it's the relationship between the green of the hills and the varying kind of strains that one would get over the course of the year into this very beautiful serpentine Connemara marble, which is a marble that's local to the house. And the clients were interested again in its map-like data and for a very strong relationship between the landscape as it comes through the house to register both the green and the kind of textures that you might find within a landscape like this. And then to the other side of that fireplace, you have the sheltered courtyard and a much different landscape, which is very much about plants and shrubs that would only survive within a sheltered landscape. But you have this very simple through view, I suppose, is the most important thing that I'm trying to communicate, where you're going from the seaside through to the sheltered courtyard, and the ability to just register both scales within one room. So this is an axo of the space that shows the 42-meter long ring beam over the main space and over the two bars that allows for an intermediate space to be made. And again, where you have a floating wall, much like Kistefos, where you have the marbled cladding over the fireplace mantelpiece. So looking from the sheltered courtyard towards this magnificent bay, you do get these opportunities to look through the house and to see the scale of landscape from one side to the other. And you get the most dramatic west setting sun opportunities in this house, while making for a very, very different landscape to the southern side of the house, which is very much like a microclimate or walled garden. The furniture within the house ultimately is very monastic in many ways and is made almost like large blocks or altarpieces, where the island of the kitchen and the tables are made in large, solid, chunky material in order to allow for that scale not to be lost within the kind of the scale of the landscape. And during summer months, you get these, beautiful bursts of nature where you're getting very diverse plants, local plants at that, where white thorn trees and flowering native plants are encouraged to grow within this particular microclimate. Oita and Oteisa, I'm almost at my last project, and this is my second last project I will show you in case you're all getting tired. This is very much a project that was given to us by Grafton Architects, by Shelley McNamara and Yvonne Farrell. And the project that we were asked to look at as a contribution to Close Encounters, which was a meeting with remarkable buildings. There were 15 architects chosen from Ireland to contribute to a group show. We were one of them, very kindly. And we were asked to look at a project by the architect Francisco Sáenz de Oiza. And it was in the Basque country, on the edge of Navarra and Basque country, up in Arantzazú. And it was a foundation for the work of Jorge Oteita. And Francisco Sáenz de Oiza and Jorge Oteiza were collaborators on this project. They were friends. They would have worked previously with one another, and they were coming towards the end of their career. And there was an opportunity, I suppose, with the local comunidad to build a foundation, a museum in the home of Jorge Oteiza that would house somehow his work. And we started this project by making iterative models and studies of both episodes within the museum building that Oteiza went on to develop. And we were particularly interested in the relationship of solid to void, taking our cue from the work of Jorge Oteiza, but also looking at how light might be tempered, how movement might be encouraged, how theatricality was introduced into spaces as simple as circulation, and how there was opportunities found within in-between spaces, not necessarily the principal space of the building, but spaces that you would somehow move through and around, and somehow to register a scale of landscape and a scale of intervention that was spatial. So there was a desire, I suppose, to make something quite condensed again, in order to register a much, much larger scale. And in order to put that in context, a painting that Jorge Oteiza was particularly interested in, this is Paolo Uccello's Battle of San Romano from 1435. And here you see a shielded contender on a white horse within an epic landscape of geometry, of lines, of metaphysical action, where somehow there is an energy that is found within a landscape scale that is somehow epic. And while we were being asked to make something that was 3 meters by 3 meters by 3 meters, we immediately set out to make something that would have an implication at a much, much larger scale. So this particular painting that Jorge Oteiza always referred to, and it's something that he returns to in his own works, somehow struck a chord with us, and we tried to set out to make a condensed, compact landscape that would somehow register the interests of both Oteiza and Oteiza. So the foundation building itself proper, you will see a sala exposición in the center, which is the deeper pink hatch, around which you have a series of galleries and circulation spaces. And the buildings that would have been Oteiza's original house with his wife are to the left. So what Oteiza is doing here is attaching on a collection of buildings and making a number of spaces that wrap around this central darkened space. And in some ways, it's like a Hellenic piece of work where you're making a temple, but you're making a temple space that is darkened and that gets light from its outer edges. So you're getting a thickness of room around these this very interesting exposition hall in the center of the space. And we were kind of interested in that, the whole notion of a spiral or coming around into something greatly attracted us. So we started off with sketches of looking at the ramps and the thickness of spaces between walls that somehow enveloped and enclosed this darkened space of the main exhibition hall. So in effect, we were being asked to interpret a building and to ensure that people would have a close encounter with this particular work by Oteiza. And rather than just keep it to Oteiza, we decided we would try and bring the work of Oteiza, the sculptor, into the work. You get these amazing opportunities to come through perspectival space where light is guiding you, where movement and color are introduced, where energy is brought in. And it's very unusual that you get this kind of monumental treatment of circulation. And what it did kind of register within us was this, again, interest in epic landscape of lines, of geometry, of, again, metaphysics of light and existence, which greatly charmed us. And you get these amazing spaces in and around that exhibition hall. These are roof light side galleries around the building, and you have them done in a kind of a blue steel that allow for this diffuse light to come in to the side spaces. So you have all these punctures through into the darkened space in the center with the ceilings painted out in black in order to allow for the survival of the objects themselves as they're being artificially lit within the space itself. So again, we would have made a lot of models, test models, looking at the kind of the shield or the contended space of the outer shell, and then the inner space, which was very much about a containment of works like models that we would have made. So we were interested to bring in the process as to how we arrived at this particular iteration through the 1:1. So we would have started again by making lots of models, and you can see here a lot of the abstract models that Oteita as a sculptor would have made, trying to register void and to register energy. A lot of these are black folded steel pieces, and to the left of the image are our iterations and our intent, beginning to try and find a way in which we would be able to register that interest in double shell and finding light and being able to bring in color and reflection and materiality into our work. So these are just some of the drawings that we would have developed for the piece. It's a very small intervention within a collection of other interventions within the room. As you know, there was 15 of them, and we couldn't go beyond 3 meters by 3 meters. So within this particular piece, we decided we would engrave certain aspects of the work onto the elevations to the side. So we 3D printed or 3D scribed the Battle of San Romano onto one wall. There was another panel engraving, which was an ode to Oteita. The plan of the building was engraved also, the foundation, and then also the setting of the relationship in Arantzazoo of the foundation building and the town proper, and all of the interventions that Oteita would have done throughout his lifetime within that town. So just very quickly to show you a number of slides of the piece as we saw it, you'll just about make out the engraving of the Battle of San Romano onto the side. We didn't want it to be overt, and we wanted it to be quite discreet so that people would pass by it and perhaps see an amount of reveal, almost like a frieze that was worked into the intervention. And we also placed a number of models at varying scales. So there was the collection of iterative Oteita studies that were integrated, and also a larger black model of the piece where we were interested in looking at the circulation space between the side galleries and the main space. All in all, you can begin to see, again, an interest and a desire to engage with the work of Oteita and the making of a lot of his abstract sculptures. And again, while we were making a space, we were very conscious not to ape or to categorize his work into a piece of architecture, but we were interested in trapping and making energetic our piece by referencing his work, I would say. So it came back to Carlo, and we had an opportunity to present it again to an Irish context. So here you can see the entrance into the pavilion with its reflective floor and reflective ceiling, almost water-like in nature. And you can see the inscribed site plan of Architectura and the ode to Oteita on the side that's given a deeper ingrain. And through this, we made for a series of pockets that would allow for some indirect light to come through the thickness of space we were making on the edges into the darkened space in the center. And coming into this, you got various perspective kind of opportunities, much like the ramps that you had in the photograph of the foundation I showed you earlier. You're beginning to get episodic spaces at different eye levels or at seat heights, where we would begin to integrate our own interpretation of the work of Oteita and Oteita. But what's quite pleasant about this, again, is just the reflection and the kind of sense of light passing across the roof or across the floor plate and beyond into the the wider exhibition hall that it was being kept in. Another view looking at light coming down from above, and also side light through one of the small apertures that we were making. And then looking into the pavilion and its primary space, which was darkened, and this sense of getting borrowed light from the side spaces of the pavilion that we were making. And this sitting in its context with the other interventions. So the last project I'm going to show you is the Dún Laoghaire Baths, and again it's at the scale, it's very much an epic scale, I would say, and it's our largest project to date. It's not yet complete, but it's certainly a very important one. We're working on the project with Dún Laoghaire Rathdown architects. So they would have originally designed the project, and we would have taken it over from planning stage, developed it in design through to tender, and we are now carrying it through to site. It's quite a complex public project, but I'm opening with, again, an artwork that means a lot to our practice. It's Lagoon City, or The City on a Lagoon, by Paul Klee from 1932. And what it does describe is a very beautiful relationship between the kind of ground of the city to the foreground, with the water and the horizon to the middle ground and background, with the skyscapes up above. And in some ways it does register a much, much larger scale than the actual project proper. And in some ways it's become something that we have become a lot more aware of, where you're having to intervene in a micro scale, but also consider the macro scale and the much, much larger sense of a project. The project, when we found it, it's a very old baths, and it has this stunning relationship with both Howth and Sandy Cove, where you have the amazing Martello Tower where Ulysses began. And it's this landscape of pools and very decrepit concrete, which would be mass concrete that had no reinforcement within it, and it has, over the last 100 years, begun to break up. But what's quite nice about this, again going back to the Anthony Haughey photograph I showed you at the outset, where you have a tamed body of water that is held within a very simple form, and then the interrelationship of that with the coastline and the rocks, and again the horizon and the sky within a project like this. The project originally started out as a project that was about rehabilitation, but it very much became a project about judged rebuilding, and I'll show you photographs of that in a moment. But just to set the context for the project, William Bligh, the great navigator and general within the British Navy, would have surveyed Dublin Bay and its navigation very, very early on in the early 1800s, and there was a need for an asylum harbour, or a place of shelter for boats within Dublin Bay at the time, and he would have earmarked the new harbour in Dún Laoghaire as the place for that. It wasn't built until 1817, when the Scottish engineer John Rennie came along and built this kilometre square body of water. It's effectively 250 acres of water, where you have a west pier and an east pier that traps a body of water to allow for the safe harbouring or asylum of boats. Our project is to the east of the east pier, where you have Scotsman's Bay. You can probably just make out where it is, but you can see this very beautiful way of rendering the water at that time by the cartographers. And what's particularly striking about Scotsman's Bay to the east of the east pier is this incredible energy that you're getting that's bouncing off the east pier and towards Scotsman's Bay. So we were having to deal with a huge amount of turbulence and wave action that was both as a result of building the east pier and the deflection of that water off towards our site, and the need to ensure there was a safe place for people to be able to swim. So this is an aerial photograph. You can just about make out to the left of this image now. We're looking towards Dún Laoghaire town and towards the Dublin mountains. You have the baths to the east of the East Pier, so to the left of this image. And it's a very, very small landscape at this scale when you're looking at the huge scale of these kilometre-long arms as they come out into Dublin Bay to make for this asylum harbour. We're having to contend with a much smaller site, but equally on a much, much grander scale, or a grand scale, with regards to its aspect and its orientation. A lot of the building around Dún Laoghaire, because of that particular force, is needing to understand the forces of nature. And we did come across amazing drawings by John Rennie where the walls are made almost like lighthouses in order to be able to take the wave impact and the forces of nature on the sheer lateral force of waves. So you get these incredible constructions around the harbour. And it's something that registered fairly quickly with us, that almost every surface was leaning or battered. And you have these incredible stone constructions, either from rubble stone or from ashlar cut stone, where you have staircases that are almost surreally going down at an angle, but made so precisely in order to be able to withstand the force of water and how it might interact with the built edge. Our site, it's a turn of the century baths complex, and this would have been a photograph that we would have received from the local authority in order to begin the project. And it's in many ways, it's an interesting part of the Dublin coastline where the water comes quite close to the river or to the road. So on one side you have a train line, and you have People's Park, which is a very beautiful park that connects Dún Laoghaire town to the coast. And then there was the separation of the metalworks or the railway lines. And then you have the pavilion. So there would have been probably a greater relationship between the park and the pavilion proper of our baths complex. But you'll see that there is not much interaction between the streetscape and the baths complex itself. And what you do have is this series of terracing of platforms down to the granite outcrop, where you have the sea coming in and varying grades of wall and defence as you make your way up towards the street. This is the pavilion as we found it, and it was boarded up. It had been fallen into disrepair for up to 20 years, and there were many proposals in order to reinstate or rehabilitate something on the site. The pavilion was proposed to be removed in many occasions, and gladly the council made a decision to spend money on rehabilitating the baths as a public baths. And you get various vestiges. This is a very beautiful terrazzo threshold mat in from the main door from Queen's Road into the building itself, where you get these beautiful insets and memories of the building itself, which are all being kept. This would have been the way it would have been actively used. You had a pool for the females and a pool for the males, with varying children's pools and changing rooms around it. And in the distance, you can see the Egyptian pavilions of Scotsman's Bay, all done in concrete, cast in situ concrete, and the chimney flues of the large boats that would have been harbouring within the bay. These would have been the mailing boats going from the United Kingdom to Ireland and back and forth, which would have been quite a strong connection. A very simple rudimentary landscape of water and terrace and ledge. And again, we were very kind of keen and anxious to ensure that the memory of the pool was kept and that it would be a place that people would enjoy as a public landscape as opposed to a privatised landscape for future generations. As I said at the outset, the concrete was in very, very poor condition when we found it, decrepit in many ways. And while the project started out as a project of rehabilitation, we quickly found that anywhere where we touched would effectively crumble because of the quality of the concrete. So we had to kind of rethink the project and begin to intervene in a little bit more of a dramatic way in order to ensure that it would be able to withstand the future forces and not kind of give a problem to the next generation by only doing a rehabilitation. So here you can see some survey photographs. Again, the East Pier extending out towards Howth, and the Egyptian pavilions of Scotsman's Bay, and the granite outcrops of the rocks to the coastal edge, and then the beginnings of interventions, be it benches that are placed in and around the landscape with these surfaces of mass concrete. And when you begin to look at the surfaces, you can see there's a lot of delamination from the groundscape beneath. And even between having prepared the tender drawings and going to site, there was even further corrosion, which again reinforced the need to take a kind of a deeper approach to how we might go about this particular project. Again, another image of the pools as we found it, showing the lap pool and the pavements that were beginning to break up. Some vestiges of the former pools and the landscape survive, obviously, and we were keen to ensure that if they were to be kept, that they could be kept, and they were kept in the same profile. These are beautiful cast in situ elements where you've got the battered edge of the wall to the seaward side, and then rounded edges to the concrete to bring it down onto the bench that would allow for the bench to become part of the wall. And also moments like this where you get an opportunity to step up from the pool edge up over a seat and down onto a jetty on the other side really did kind of reinforce within us a kind of a need to think about making sure that elements like this weren't necessarily lost to future generations. You do get these amazing palimpsest-like pieces of construction where you're getting Victorian paving and former Victorian stairs somehow built over and heightened, and then ultimately heightened again at the turn of the 20th century with wave baffles at the very top with curving sections. And further on from that then shelters that were cast in situ, concrete beams and pillars, all make for a landscape that has withstood the forces of nature. And again, we had to ensure that a lot of this was kept, and not that it would be lost to reconstruction or rebuilding. So there were moments where we were operating almost like archaeologists, and other moments then where we were working as architects, trying to ensure a dialogue with what was there from the past. Stunning pieces of masonry and stonework where you're getting interlinking of stones, and even from like looking at the risers and the treads of the stair blocks there, you can see there's a nodule or a kind of a tongue and a groove from each of these pieces of stone that interlock. But what's, I suppose, very beautiful about this particular image is just the relationship of what would have been there first and what was added to it, and that somehow they're there to kind of converse with one another in a way to register that palimpsest or discussion with time. And our own interventions have to contend with that in this larger, almost epic landscape. Other uses here, you can see staircases and stair treads being reused in the middle section where they're infilled and they're turned on their side before being cast with this mass concrete wall done in day pours with the lip for the wave baffle on the top. And again, opportunities where you're getting this sedimented layering of concrete placed onto the Wicklow granite ashlar constructions for the building edges and the jetty edges as it would have been planned previous. So our project in many ways began, there's a plan of the upper level on the very, very far bottom left or bottom right of the image. And on the upper part, the main drawing is basically trying to contend with what we had to remove in blue and what we were to retain in red. And there were sections of walls that we just couldn't keep, and certainly outbuildings that weren't of value. And we had to, I suppose, try and ensure that we weren't wiping away everything. So there were judgments being made on this kind of landscape as we worked through it. And also with the pavilion proper, we were having to remove quite a lot of the interior because it was fire damaged and it was effectively infested with pigeons, and that meant for a very dangerous environment. So we tried to keep as much again as we could of the shell of the building, while ensuring that the memory and the kind of use or the future use of the building is retained. So some light sketches to start to again show our intervention, where we would make for a series of walkways and access and counter access across the site in order to encourage permeability and to allow for people to be able to sit and find some solace within the kind of the town of Dún Laoghaire, and to allow for a greater enjoyment of the coast with bathing in mind. So we made for this model, it's a model at a landscape scale. To the left of the image, you have the pier that extends out into Dublin Bay that we are making, with a pedestal for a sculpture of Roger Casement. To the right of the image, you have the pavilion, which we are effectively reinstating and remaking. And then in between that, you have a series of walkways, one at a high level onto the street with terraces for the cafe, one at the intermediate level, and then one at the lower level. So there are three levels effectively within the project, and around which we are having to make a series of walls and lines within the landscape in many ways to try and ensure that the waves are being able to be withstood, but also that people are being carefully orchestrated through the site with movement and with a kind of a sense of enjoyment. So a number of the models that we would have made, this was a more developed model of the fourth facade of the pavilion looking towards the sea. We were able to keep the three side and front elevations onto Queen's Road. And this model, I suppose, is just trying to show the connection from Queen's Road down onto the intermediate level, and a new amphitheatre onto the sea that we're making with a sea pool and various outposts or lookout points along this intermediate level, from the bandstand on the right-hand side to the staircase leading down from People's Park, and then onto a central lookout point and further lookout points to the other side. So what you're getting here is a three-layered or a three-tiered project that kind of goes from the pavilion down onto the intermediate level and then down onto the sea level. And another photograph of that as it's developing. So a lot of our projects was about walls and making sure that the walls were able to withstand the force of nature. And in some cases, the walls are up to 1.5 meters thick, and in certain places 2 meters. And again, we were trying to ensure that the biodiversity of the area would be integrated and accommodated. So a lot of the maritime gardens of Scotsman's Bay are intended to flow into this particular pool complex. But we were having to contend, I suppose, with a hierarchy of walls from a low level at sea side up to the pavilion. And we were keen to ensure that the batter and that the angle of all of those walls would be registered and that they would be experienced. So we would have made a lot of models. These are test models in concrete. And this was looking at the kind of day pores that one might get in a concrete wall, and somehow just allowing for a projected lip to come out to give it a scale. It was a test model that we didn't develop any further than that, but it was certainly an interesting moment in the project where we were beginning to cast and make parts of the model and parts of the project with concrete. This was looking at the jetty, and we've now ended up with a round tip to the jetty. that mimics the Martello Tower in Sandy Cove in the distance. But just the energy that one might get by making a set of steps down to the water level around the monument, a very, very long bench that skirts the inner side, the sheltered side of the jetty from the winds, and then a notional idea of steps up to a platform that would allow for swimmers or people to dive from the edge of the jetty, and how one might be able to just make, I suppose, a landscape of masonry, of poured in situ concrete, in this case reinforced, with one material, and make it something that is robust and of a scale that is registered in the landscape. So the project, I'm just going to show you a few photographs of the project as it stands presently. This is from a number of months ago. In the distance, in the background of the photograph, you can see the quarry of Dalkey. And a lot of the stone that we're using in the baths is the quarry that is quarried from that particular area of Dublin. It would have been the source of much of the stonework for many of the fine buildings in Dublin, and certainly the paving of Dublin would have come from Dalkey quarry. You can see in this photograph that it's a Victorian setting. Some very, very fine dwellings of 2 stories to 3 stories in height that make for a promenade along the edge. But we're having to contend with quite a steep fall from the Queen's Road. You can see the railings on the left of the image, where we have our hoarding in the trees. That's the street level. And we're effectively having to come down up to 13 meters from that first floor, down into a sculpture area on the ground floor of the pavilion, and then down further on. So there's been quite a lot of earth movement and clearance, while also trying to retain as much as we could of the aspects of the site that we felt were of value, and that could be retained. So this is the pavilion as we stripped away the parts that were affected. A lot of the walls had embedded steel that simply had corroded and had to be removed. So there was a lot of trial and investigation in order to try and understand how this pavilion might stand. So there was a lot of temporary works, and everything you see in that photograph is now retained. And what was very, very interesting about this, much like the walls that we would have found in and around the site, was this layering and palimpsest of crude material through to finer materials as you went to the top of the pavilion itself. This is a view of the cafe terrace as it's going to be, looking at the east side of the pavilion, looking towards East Pier, and you have the Martello Tower in behind the scaffold, which I'll show you in a moment in a few photographs. But it's an important screen wall in that it has this very simple tripartite division, and we cut down the centre place in order to allow for a doorway to come from the cafe, a public cafe, out onto a public terrace. And another photograph then, this is the other side of the pavilion with the workshop that we retained and in parts had to rebuild, with a staircase that comes down from Queen's Road in order to give a counter access to the avenue or the access of Queen's Road. Again, a lot of it is working with existing as well as working with proposed constructions. You'll see from the concrete we're exposing the aggregate, and a lot of that is washed out. And that's used throughout the site. And just some of the energies that we're beginning to find and generate within the site itself, where we're beginning to crank and break certain directions and lines within the making of this jetty. So you're getting this shifting view all of the time, and coming down and descending as well as ascending up from the jetty. It's beginning to offer some very interesting and dramatic relationships. That's all at the same time as thinking of this amazing horizon line that we have to play with. And again, coming back to the scale of the epic landscape that I was referring to a moment ago, this is not a small project by any means. You're having to contend with a much, much larger scale. So the stone and the work, this is the Dalkey granite that is mixed into the concrete mix. It's quite a challenging concrete to work with in that it's 50% GGBS, which is ground granulated bast slag, a recycled material, and we're having to whiten the concrete slightly with that GGBS. But what's quite beautiful about it is the aggregates that you're getting through from retarding the surface and washing the surface of the concrete 24 hours after it being set. As well as that, we're having to external polish the footpaths. And here you're getting, again, all of the local stones as well as the Dalkey granite in the aggregate mix, ground down enough to give a slip resistance. It's not a high polish, and effectively it will be something that will be able to be exposed. And again, we were kind of finding the detail and the kind of beauty of what you grind and what you find within a stone mix like this to be a really kind of beautiful part of the project so far. So we're beginning to introduce a number of cranks and bends and twists within the project. There's a lot of heavy civils work going on in order to reinforce and strengthen a number of the existing retaining walls. And there's also this incredible, almost Colosseum-like baffle system of walls underneath a number of the battered walls. And it's almost sad to have to cover them up. I would have loved to have exposed this almost gargantuan scale to the force of these walls and what they have to withstand with regards to the waves that hit them. But by all means, it's been a long process in order to enable and to ensure that the project can withstand at least the force of nature for the next 100 to 150 years. So a lot of the walls are quite massive, big, bold walls. We didn't want any secondary detailing in it. We wanted them to be very, very simple and very forceful in nature. And there's a hierarchy of walls, again, relating to one another, some low walls to middle scale walls to high walls. And there are opportunities for overhangs as well for shelters. So there's going to be a bench cast underneath a large cantilevered concrete roof here that allows for people who are going for a swim to change under shelter and to allow for a pleasant view and seating that faces south. And there's going to be other opportunities then for small beaches. We're making a number of inlets and small pockets where we're casting benches and steps of a much larger, more monumental scale to the edges and allowing for natural sediment to happen over time. Up onto the pavilion, we're casting a ground floor heights wall with a very light batter, a very small canted angle, again with very simple pour lines and castings, and we're integrating benches into all of the openings along the bottom of the windows in order to, again, offer an opportunity to sit within the building while being outside. Internally, much like a Venetian hall of a palazzo, there's a long, deep room from one side of the pavilion to the other, and we're making for a series of large opening doors out onto small balconets onto the seaward side. And we were keen that the interior would somehow have another scale or a finer increment. So we're making this timber as an exposed timber roof that's going to be painted white with very simple lighting and a polished concrete floor that leads down to the ground floor. You can see at the end of this view there's a staircase that will bring you down to the artist studio area of the pavilion, and the railings to the interior of the stairs will be bronze. This was just a mock-up to show the profile and the sections we were trying to achieve, but it's very much in the kind of scale of a public room, a very, very simple scale of repeated trabeated roofing with a very simple floor to ceiling height. And then downstairs, this was just after the ceiling was struck, just in case you think we do bad concrete in Ireland. This is a very robust, almost turbine hall-like ceiling soffit that we're exposing within the artist studios on the lower level. And a wall that is highly serviced, that is yet to be clad out into a number of artist studios in and around this very simple 4-meter high artists' foyer, where there's going to be exhibitions and doorways out onto terraces to the sea. And then a workshop to the side, which we had to rebuild in terms of the roof and the front wall, in order to allow for a rooflet space for a sculpture studio or sculpture workshop with a very simple square opening out onto the intermediate level for public to be able to come and go into this public space. So just a few final photographs I'm going to show you. These are just photographs I've taken over the last number of months. To the horizon line, you can see the round object there, which is the Martello Tower, which is the taller element there at the tip of the outlet. And that's, for those who are familiar with James Joyce, on the roof of that is where Ulysses began. And we were kind of keen to echo that sense of Martello. There was a Martello Tower on the site previous to that, and we've made for a slight rounded nose to this jetty as it projects out into Dublin Bay with the plinth for the monument. And you can see here again the beginnings, or should I say the development of the 3 levels within the site, from the pavilion over on Queen's Road to the left, to the right of the image, as you work down the coast down into the kind of the swimming area and where we're going to have the pool. So what I've enjoyed very much about this over the last number of years, well, it is years, but months particularly, is just how weather can be registered and how the changing weather by the coast somehow changes the reading of this epic landscape. And again, in coastal kind of fog, which very much reminds me of Venice and all my times when I was there in Venice during the early springs and the late winters. Just how weather can somehow change the legibility and the feel of a particular project. And this is the more recent reading of the project as it is developing. You can see the site gets flooded quite regularly, and it's a super challenge for contractors. Interestingly, I've been telling Nicola, we've been working with Venetian contractors on this, as well as Irish contractors. And that's been an experience in itself. And it's probably for another story in another time. But you can see from the kind of quality of the construction, it's thick concrete walls with very judged moments where you begin to break or turn or stop a construction in order to introduce a view or an opportunity to make for a stairs or plinth. This is looking from the stairs coming down from Queen's Road from People's Park, and eventually the view that you will get out onto this pedestal with the sheltered roof coming out over the changing area. And the sculpture that will go on the top is a sculpture that's been made by an English artist, a very interesting English artist called Mark Richards. And he has made a bronze sculpture that will be arriving into Dún Laoghaire in the next number of weeks to months, that will be placed on this pedestal. And it's Roger Casement, one of our great patriots, walking towards the coast as opposed to towards the United Kingdom that we face from Dublin towards the east. And the last image I have here is just the monument and the registering again of the landscape from the point of view of the horizon, but also relating to the Martello Tower to the right of the image there, and somehow making dialogue with distances and with scale in works that we're continually ongoing with. So thank you very much. I'm sorry it's been so long. I hope I've kept your attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. It was really a very intense and thick lecture, and so it's quite difficult to open the debate because there are many possibility of questions and issues to debate. But anyway, I hope we can have some minutes to have a little debate about, and I think we can have also in future possible contacts, because I'm surely interested to go deeply in some of the questions you put on. Particularly, I'm very interested, much interested in this preparation you have about Otesa and the size the work, because I was there making a lecture about this in Otesa, and so I tried. I found some connection between the work, and it would be nice also to discuss about with a Spanish friend of mine, Spanish friend of mine, who is a very good scholar about Otesa, and so it would be nice to discuss.
I think on that point,
I'm just putting one of the many things you proposed. What is I think the common interest I found in your work is not to confuse the architecture work and the landscape work, but to have in a way the possibility to use architecture as a device, a very important device to which is an artificial device, of course, but to use it to comprehend, to enrich also, and to interpret the landscape. And this is, I think, is very interesting also comparing with the other lecture we had, because your proposal is surely a proposal from an architect, from an architect's side, but very strongly linked to the possibility to use the abstract and the artificial work of the architects to have a possibility to dialogue with the landscape, without confusion, without confounding the two things. And I think this is a possibility to discuss, very interesting. Of course, all you had many scales of intervention. What is interesting to me is also this use you can have also to use the art experience, the abstract art experience. I saw this, for example, this use of Joseph Halber's work, or something is something like what is many times underlined by an architect as Tadawando, for example, who is who is trying to put together the sensibility for the landscape from the Oriental tradition with an abstract teaching of the art and architecture in Western countries, and this is a very good fusion. And I found in your work this possibility, and also in this very huge intervention on Dublin coast, and so this is really a possibility to have a connection with the possibility of architecture to do huge intervention, also very strong, very hard, but with a possible very strong sensibility to the landscape. It's something like Palestrina or something like that. So, okay.
Thank you, Renato. That's a very nice commentary. I don't want to answer it because I think your commentary is enough in many ways. I think you've captured what I'm trying to register and what I'm trying to find in both artwork that I might bring to a project, but using that artwork to register specific qualities of the site or the history of the site or the scale of a site. So I think what you've said is very generous and very thoughtful. But I think it's a very nice comment that you've given me food for thought in that.
Nicola?
Well, I'm happy that I've seen and I've been told the story of a few new projects that you know about, like that haven't been published yet. And I think that, yeah, as you said, I'm not going to add much more to it. Architecture in this case is a very well thought and well devised device to be not only to be inhabited or to be used, but also to to be used not only internally but also in relationship with many things, like the culture of a place in a broad sense of the visual culture, which is the landscape, as a lens to see it, and also taking advantage of every element that you find in a place. For example, in the urban grain of the very first project that you showed us, you take the city and a landscape that you can see from a certain point of view, and that maybe is not the most direct or the most obvious landscape, like the one of the roofs of the terraces in Stony Butter, and you take advantage of a space in every sense of a gap, in a way, to create a new landscape that has been actually taken up by other people on that lane. I know you shown the original image, but someone has built another couple of houses that trying to move, like
that's life in cities, Nicola. You can't hold people back, and they don't have to follow the same line. But I do think there's a subtext in what I've just presented, which is about young architects. I'm not young anymore, I would say middle-aged, but certainly when I started out practicing in my own practice 15 years ago, we've always held an interest in public work, and it's trying to get public work in an Irish context is very challenging still. So any opportunity that you have to work within a public realm that's not in somebody's back garden, but is actually making street or making lane or making public realm or intervening with a piece of furniture, you have to take those opportunities with incredible responsibility, but also with a sense to how architects of a young to a middle age can make things that are, effective and can be of value and worth to a city. And I think that discussion is ongoing and it's developing a lot more. And I'm glad to see that there are more architects getting opportunities to work in a public realm. But it's always a challenge to find that work. And I suppose that's something that we want to continue doing.
Well, in a way, as you said, even when you work on a private project like the Lucky Lane one, it is a private commission and everything, but the impact that you can have on the public space, on the public realm of the city, is still very important. So there is a responsibility of the architect, of the designer in that terms, not only when you tackle a big public project that is in its essence very community based or community oriented, like this one that you showed, but also when I think about the bridge house in Galway, that one has quite consequence on the landscape where it sits, and that was interesting. I saw a couple of pictures of it previously, but I never thought about the fact that all those shrubs and the local biodiversity was like springing because you created the sheltered half-open courtyard on one side of it, so that you're mediating between a domestic and small-scale landscape that is still quite natural in the true sense of it, and the big landscape that you're looking at from on the seaside. So I found that very interesting as well. Always mediating between the dimension of the private and the scale of the private and the public. So that's always a responsibility in a way that we take, that we have, and we should take.
Sorry, I propose you to close the PowerPoint so we see you better.
Okay, let me just escape. How do I leave this? Oh, there you go.
The content.
Oh.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, so that's nice.
Hi, Antonio.
If there's se qualcuno ha delle altre domande o delle osservazioni da fare, if someone want to observe something from the public, anche in italiano, perché poi eventualmente Nicola può tradurre. C'è qualcuno?
Maybe I can make a question.
Prego.
I saw in one of the last projects that you showed to us, OITA projects, things in common with the house Crochet of Le Corbusier, especially the ramp and the column.
Yes.
I don't know if maybe the materials that he used can be the same.
So you're talking about the house in Argentina?
Yeah, the one with the ramp.
It's an interesting question because I always think of the Museo Fundación de OITA, or say de OITA, excuse me, to be something like La Tourette, because it has this hilltop setting that's very much a block within the landscape, with this even side chapel of roof lights that come from the side galleries. I know OITA was particularly interested in the work of Le Corbusier, but the ramp in itself, I think the ramp in the Museo is much more robust, and it almost feels like the ground that's folding, as opposed to the delicacy of that ramp that I know in Dr. Curachet's house in Argentina. But there is an interest in promenade for sure in the work, and an interest in experiencing going from one level to another. The materials in Curachet's house, it's very much a white abstract kind of house in many ways. And I wouldn't have ever thought of the richness or the daring kind of use of materials that OITA uses in Al-Suzu, which is more a red concrete and black steel and black painted surfaces. So yes, there is a dialogue. I don't want to be going around the circles. I think your question is very good. But I think there's a richer interest in the materials being more of the earth in Al-Suzu, where you're getting the color of the local geology, stone and the kind of the granite stone that's used on the existing houses of Oita, but also just the manipulation of light and how you get light falling across ramps, and the illumination and the I suppose the theatrical quality that you get in Oita's foundation. It's quite extraordinary when you're there. It's almost intimate.
And maybe if I can interrupt you,
yeah.
Even the relationship with the ramp and the columns are quite the same in the two projects.
Okay.
Even the distance, I mean, it's quite the same in both projects.
Yes, you're talking about the central column between the two flights of ramp. Yeah, no, that is fair. Yeah, no, I think you're right, and I think Oita is certainly referring to certain aspects of Corbusier's work. I would have thought Dr. Curachet's house is a little finer and more refined than almost more abstract and less haptic than the work of Oita in Al-Suzu. But yes, you're right. There's definitely a lineage and an interest in circulation, and the use of the column and the ramp is very present, and it's very strong in that particular space.
Thank you, and thanks for the presentation. It was really interesting.
Thank you very much. I'm very, very pleased to hear.
Just a few words about this question of the Al-Suza Foundation, because I think you had a good interpretation of the relationship between Otesa's culture and the science interpretation on architecture, which in my opinion, science de Oisa has interpreted, and in this case is important, the Corbusian contribution and the idea of recovering the promenade of the Corbusier, because he in reality interpreted the space of Otesa's sculpture in an active and dynamic situation, which was not specifically the goal declared by Otesa, because Otesa normally declared to want to perceive the void as a possibility of metaphysical and immobilization.
Yes.
So I think science gave an interpretation more dynamic and more as an architect.
Yeah.
And introducing also, for example, color, introducing that problem of space that now the student was underlining about the Coruchet house or operation of Le Corbusier. And surely there's a mixing of Corbusian contribution with Otesa. And you, I think, in your installation, I remember to have seen in the Biennale, I think what was interesting, you were continuing in a way the interpretation of science in the work of Otesa, giving this haptic situation, which is not in reality in the intention of Otesa, I think, but it's a consequence of his work. for this reason, it would be nice to discuss with my friend Jorge Ramos, because he made exactly a doctorate thesis about the active space of Otesa.
Okay.
And he worked exactly on this problem to conceive what may be the contribution out of the sculpture and going to the architecture. But this was also a finality of Otesa, because he decided in the 60s, he decided not to do sculptural work at all, and to pass to
That's right.
to town planning and architecture and so on.
Yeah.
And this is very interesting, I think, of this.
Right.
And it's connected, I think, with the work you had, for example, also in the art center in Tullamore, or in the house in front of the ocean, because you used this device, this special device, to have the possibility to burn the clouds, or to organize the relationship with the ground. This is very interesting of your work also. The work in relation with the ground, I think, is really important.
Yeah. I mean, I came across a lot of those interests from working in the studio of Moneo, and Rafael Moneo knew Oita and Oteita, and indeed was very interested in Vacío, the void, in his own work, and he was constantly looking to the work of Oteita particularly. He would have worked for Oita when he graduated from school, so there was already a kind of an introduction there to it. So there was a nice marriage when I was being asked to look at this particular project. But you're right, Renato. There is an interest to trap or to capture a space that isn't necessarily defined in our work, that allows for registering the scale of landscape or the size of clouds, things that are probably a little bit more ephemeral, and that are not so required in a house, shall we say. There are special things like being able to see horizon line. So there is that interest in, I suppose, being able to understand the ground condition that these things rest on, and how you might make space and how you might pick a material to build something from is all part of that process, and becomes quite complex when you start to introduce interests that you have in art into the work, and it becomes a kind of a rich dialogue. But I'm enjoying your commentary. I might ask you to write an essay on our work for us. Thank you very much.
Okay. Are other questions? Ci sono altre domande? I think Christmas is doing.
Exactly. Yeah. Can I thank you again, Professor Bocchi and Nicola, for the lovely introduction, as well as Antonio. It's been an absolute pleasure and a great honor to lecture to your university, and I've passed through your portal so many times, and now that I know people within the actual institution, I'll be coming back with a little bit more purpose the next time. But it's been a very good honor to give this lecture, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you to you and all Ireland also. It's nostalgia to be in Ireland.
Very
okay,
good.
That's fine.
It was so nice, you, Peter. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Bye.
Allora, niente, per finire anche in italiano, io intanto ringrazio tutti quanti quelli che hanno voluto seguire questa intensa relazione e faccio ovviamente a tutti quanti grandissimi auguri per queste feste e speriamo che questa Christmas lecture sia di buon auspicio. Non ho portato il cappello di Babbo Natale, ma si poteva fare forse nell'occasione. Grazie ad Antonio per il supporto sempre importante della Stowe Foundation, grazie a tutti gli ospiti, vedo che ci sono vari ospiti anche internazionali che si sono collegati. Buon Natale a tutti e speriamo che l'anno prossimo sia un po' meglio di quello che è molto facile che sia meglio, ma insomma speriamo che sia davvero un anno un po' più felice di quello che ahimè abbiamo passato e stiamo ancora passando. Allora vi ringrazio, io spero che con Peter possiamo continuare i contatti anche in futuro, cercheremo senz'altro di avere i contatti. Ringrazio molto Nicola per questa connessione che mi pare sia stata fruttuosa e cercheremo di continuare. Nicola, se vuoi aggiungere qualcosa, lascio a te concludere.
Beh, ringrazio lei per l'opportunità, insomma, di portare anche Peter a fare questa lecture. And it was a great pleasure to introduce A2 Architects and Peter here at Iuav, final Iuav. As I said to him the other day, he's got another tick, another box ticked on the European universities. So very happy about that. And yeah, thanks again to Stowe Foundation and to you for letting me introduce him. It was a pleasure to hear the lecture. Very, very appreciated. And happy holidays to everybody. Merry Christmas.
Grazie a voi tutti allora.
Ciao Antonio.
Ciao.
I try to use the holiday to do other limericks because I'm very about limericks. Okay.
Excellent.
Bye bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Ciao.
Bye bye.
Arrivederci a tutti.
Grazie, arrivederci.
Grazie, arrivederci.
Arrivederci, buon Natale.